my background, I was born near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and a little village called Glenshaw, and I was born in 1916, and in 1926, I think it was, my family moved to Hollywood. We lived in Pittsburgh, and the smoke was pretty bad. They were making steel with soft coal, and the doctor told one of my sisters that she wouldn't make it through another winter if we didn't get out of there. So we packed up and moved to Hollywood, and I went through school at Hollywood, graduated from Hollywood High School. But while I was the way I got up here, when I was still in high school, just had gotten my driver's license, I was hired by a movie producer at Universal Studio. And I would go to school half a day, and then in the afternoon I would pick up the boss's mother and older sister and drive them around. We would go visiting or shopping or whatever. And in the summer of 1934, they had me drive them up here. And we stayed at the Hotel Del Monte, which was was one of the 10 great hotels of the country, of the world at that time. And they treated me just like one of the family. It was American plan. All 3 meals were included. My room cost $8. And but I would get dressed up and eat with them, and then after breakfast we'd drive around. We went around the 17-mile drive, which I don't remember it as even being paved at that time. This was 1934. But then in the next summer, 1935, my parents moved to Monterey, and we opened a restaurant in the hotel Mission Inn, which is on Tyler Street. It was in the old Estrada adobe, and they added 2 floors on top of the adobe, and it was a very beautiful building at the time. Now it's back to the way it was originally, but it was a family affair. We did all the cooking. The only thing we served that wasn't there was bread for toast and ice cream. Everything else was done right on the spot. And to give you an idea what it was like, we served a full course pre-priced dinner for 85 cents, which included a cocktail, fish or fruit cocktail, main course, soup, and then a main course, which always included an abalone steak. We had 7-inch #1 abalone steaks, which we sold, was all for 85 cents, including a beverage and dessert. It was quite a meal for 85 cents. But we didn't know it, but my mother was coming down with cancer, so she just couldn't keep up, so my folks sold out and moved back to Los Angeles, and I, along with my older brother and sister, stayed on, and that's how I happened to meet Doris, and it was a good thing that I stayed on. During the canning season, which was 6 months of the year, word would go out that such and such a cannery was hiring, so people would just congregate at the entrance to the cannery. And one day I was badly in need of a job, so I joined his crew. They said that Del Monte brand or Calpac was hiring, so we congregated at the door, and pretty soon George Dollar, I guess he was the foreman, came to the door, and there's a whole bunch of maybe 50 of us standing around in the street. And he looked us over, and pretty soon he pointed to me and then to a couple of other guys, motioned us in, and we were hired. No application, no resume, no nothing. He just motioned us in and turned us over to somebody who gave us a job, and that was it. It was pretty easy. But it was a union job. It was just the beginning of the cannery union, and so we had to join the union, and my pay was 57.5 cents an hour. I don't know what the half cent was for, but anyway, that was what I was paid, and I worked there for 1937 and 38, I think it was. The fish came in, of course, they fished at night when it was dark, and the boats would come in, and when each cannery had a contract with a certain number of boats which fished for them, and when the boats would come in, the canneries would blow their whistles, which were deep like steamship whistles. And each cannery had a code, like 2 longs and a short, or whatever it was. And they would blow these whistles, and it would wake you up, and you got to listen for that particular whistle in your sleep, and you'd go to work. But if your whistle didn't blow, in my case, instead of waiting around at home for the telephone to ring or the whistle to blow, I'd go down and hang around down on Cannery Row, and I got to know Ed Ricketts. I was interested in what he was doing, and if you would talk to him and ask a question, he would talk all day. If you were interested in marine biology and showed an interest in what he was doing, he loved his work. He was very intelligent, very articulate. He would talk. He was not only a marine biologist, he was an historian, he was a philosopher. He and John Steinbeck got along extremely well together. But you've seen pictures of his lab. There was a stairway up to where he kept his equipment, and then down underneath is where he did his packing. But the door was a garage door, and it was always unlocked, and you could wander in there any time. And if you showed any interest, he'd tell you about it. Out in the back, if you are familiar with it, you can go to the new hotel, whatever the name of it is. On the back of the hotel is a veranda that runs a full length on the bay side. And then at the, what would it be, the west side, Pacific Grove side, you can walk along that and look right down into his backyard. Or you can see these little cement rectangular basins that he built where he would keep things. As fishermen, if they came across something unusual, they'd take it over to him, and he'd put water in one of these basins, and that's where I picked up a lot of information from him. And so if you're ever down there, be sure to go by and look down. You can see there's a little smaller than this little rug here, and there's, I don't know how many, but several of those little things are still there. And so I really got acquainted with him then, and he was a very interesting, very much the way Steinbeck pictured him. He was kind, he was generous, he was intelligent, he would take time with you. According to the book, people tried their best to take advantage of him and try to get a little money from him, but he wasn't dumb by any means. He could see through this, but Doris and I both got to know several of the people in the book, because Steinbeck used their real names, and we both knew some of the characters in the book, which makes that one of our favorite books to read, because we knew the people in it. After, in 1936, the way I got started down there was in 1936, about Thanksgiving time, there was a fire in the Del Mar cannery, which destroyed it. It burned practically to the ground and took Ed Ricketts' lab with it. And I got a job cleaning up after the fire, which wasn't a very fun job. But then after we got it cleaned up, I was hired to help rebuild Del Mar Cannery. And I worked there till it was finished, and then I went down the row and got a job at CalPac, California Packing, or Del Monte brand. And so that's how I got involved with Cannery Row. So after we got married, I had to go into the service for 3 years, and after that I went back to school and got degrees from San Jose State and Stanford. And I was offered a job at, I was working for the University of Pacific in Pacific Grove. We were living up there, and I was working as a high school teacher, but the university wanted me to come and teach for them, which I did for a while, and then I was offered a job down here. We wanted to get back to Monterey County, so I took that, but continued teaching summers at the university in Stockton. And I taught there for nearly 30 years and retired. Golly, I've been retired now for I think 26 years. But I really enjoyed teaching. It was a great experience.
I came to Monterey in the 1920s, and the reason was that my two aunts had a thriving millinery business in Salinas, and they decided that they wanted to retire in Pacific Grove. And so they came to Monterey first on Hawthorne Street, just across the street here, and they bought a house. And I remember as a little kid coming down to visit them before I even went to school. But I was born in San Francisco and raised on a ranch in Alamo, California, where we grew pears, and my father worked in San Francisco as a writer for a hotel reporter. Whenever there was a new hotel that went up someplace in western United States, he would be the one that would write it up. And so he only came home weekends, and he came on a train to Alamo. But because my aunts were my mother's sisters, and we had a lot to do with them, and they helped raise my younger sisters and I. I had two twin sisters who were younger. And I came from a family that came to Salinas from the gold rush country. They came from Jackson and Volcano. And the reason they came here was during the gold rush. But when the gold petered out, people had to get a job someplace else. The young men, my great-grandfather did all right in the gold. He was one of the first hydraulic miners, which is really not a good thing, they say today, but that's what he was. And then his son came down to Salinas because the railroad came into Salinas, and that was a place where young men could get a job. And then he sent for my aunts, and his mother and father came down to live in Salinas and are buried in the Garden of Memories in Salinas along with John Steinbeck. But the family lived in Salinas when Steinbeck was born, and I've heard lots of stories about Steinbeck. And because Salinas only had 2,000 people when he was born, and of course everybody knew each other at that time, and especially being in business as these ladies were. Then they moved to New Monterey here on Hawthorne Street. Then later, they bought a place in Pacific Grove where they really wanted to live, and that was on 9th and Central, and that house is still there. Was built in 1886. But we would come down to visit them, and even before I went to school, I'd come down and we'd go to the beach in Pacific Grove, where they had a bathhouse, and the bathhouse had 2 plunges, and these plunges were, one was salt water and the other was ordinary heated water, and they had a high diving pier, and we'd go down, my sister and I, she was older than I. She was about 15 and I was about 5. And we'd watch the divers plunge into this plunge, and it was steamingly hot down there. But it was the place to go in Pacific Grove because we could walk to it. And they had a dance hall and they had a bowling alley. They sold popcorn and they had food, and then you could go to the beach, and I just spent a lot of time at that beach down there, and it was fun. I think my sister wanted to go because the soldiers from the Presidio would come down there a lot, and she'd get down there and talk to them, and that was fun. Then later, after going back to Alamo and the ranch, my mother got ill, and she couldn't take care of us children. She had a bad case of asthma, so we came down to live with the aunts in Pacific Grove. And the one aunt worked in a bakery on Hoffman Street, and it was owned by the John Flaws family. And it was on Hoffman and just above Foam Street. And they had a little girl my age. I was about 7 and in the 2nd grade. And I would come down when my aunt worked at the bakery, especially on Saturdays, and play with Mary Flaws. And we were allowed to go play it down on Foam Street, but we could never go on Wave or on Ocean View, which is now Cannery Row, because it was considered an unseemly place for little girls to be on their own. It was kind of a rough element down there with all the workers of the cannery. But one of my aunts, after they retired, bought some houses here in Monterey and Pacific Grove and rented them. And among them were the little houses that the cannery workers worked in. And she had about 10 or 12 little houses that were just one room. And we would come down once a month to get the rent, and it cost $5 for each cabin a month, and that was part of her income after they retired from Salinas. And I would come down with her from the bakery, and we would collect the rent. And the houses just had one little cot in it, an iron stove, wood stove, and a table and a couple of chairs, running water, and a closet. And for that, they paid $5 a month. And as I say, we would come down there, and I guess the Monterey History Society decided that these were historical houses, and they would save some of them. So they put 3 of them down on Cannery Row now. They had been on Wave Street, my aunts were. And so they're still there, that you can see them. They're fixed up like a museum. You look in and you see they're just the way that they were, just a simple little cabin with just this small amount of furniture, but that's where the cannery workers and some of the fishermen lived. And the reason we collected the rent was because some of them, didn't read or write or speak English, and so that was our job. But then later, I came to stay in Pacific Grove and went to grammar school. Then I'd go back to Alamo. Then I came back, and my mother came too, and she bought a house on 18th Street, and we didn't live with my aunt anymore for a while, but she did keep the twins. The aunts were wonderful people and really helped us out in our family. And then I went to high school and graduated from Pacific Grove High School. And then after high school, I didn't know exactly what to do. I got some jobs in Monterey. I worked at the dollar store for 35 cents an hour. I worked at Penny's for 35 cents an hour. And then I got a job. This was during, just as the Depression was starting in the early 30s, and 29 and 30. And so any job you could get was a good job. And then they started with when President Roosevelt came in, he started the National Youth Authority, and I worked for them. And I worked in a nursery school way up here on the hill in the edge of New Monterey and Pacific Grove. There was a nursery school put on by this National Youth Authority, and I worked there for about a year and saved money in order to go to college. And I found out that I had quite a love for working with little children, and I decided to be a teacher. And then I went on to San Francisco State. But the woman that was the head of the nursery was named Julia Brennig, and she gave me a ride to her home once, and she lived in the
Gallatin.
Well, it was Gallatin's at that time. Now it's the Stokes building. And she, I think, was a Gallatin, and she lived in this Gallatin house. And Gallatin's had a very good restaurant there, a very upscale restaurant that we would go to a few times. And now I think it's Stokes, a restaurant, and I believe it's still a restaurant. So anyway, that's the reason I went to Pacific Grove. But then, I went to church, and Joe went to church too, and we met one evening, and he asked to walk home with me. And so we started from there, and he said, well, how about a date next weekend? So we did that, and that's how it all got started. And then at that time, Joe was working in Canneries. He was hired down there. He'll tell you about that. And he would come to see me to make a date, and he'll tell you why I didn't let him in. We'd stand on the porch instead of inviting him in.
When I was working in a cannery, of course, you pick up the smell, your clothes or your skin or your hair. And so when I'd come to visit her, she'd make me stand out on the porch downwind, and we got to know each other pretty well. But then later I went on into the service, and we decided if we were going to have any time together, we better get married. So we did right after the war started. And we say we're related by marriage for the last 70 years.
Steinbeck writes about a man that he met, that Ed Ricketts met out on the beach at Asilomar. And I was lucky enough to have seen that man. And I can't find anybody in Monterey or anywhere around at that time that ever saw him. But he was the one that Steinbeck wrote the story about in
Sweet Thursday.
In Sweet Thursday, which is a book about Pacific Grove. And when Steinbeck lived there, he wrote about various funny things that happened in Pacific Grove, and this was one of them. And in that picture of the house that I showed you, it had a tower, And one of the bedrooms, I was standing in the tower window looking out on Central Avenue, and I saw this strange man walking down the street. And he was barefooted, and he was about 7 feet tall. He was one of the biggest people I had ever seen. And he had a pair of tennis shoes hanging from a rope belt around his stomach, and he had kind of coveralls on with great big pockets, and the pockets had fruit and vegetables kind of spilling out of the back pockets on his back end. And he had a hat on. He had a long white beard and white hair, and he had a hat on that looked like it had belonged to a horse at one time, because it had window cuts in it for the ears to stick out. And I thought he was the strangest looking man that was walking down the street, and right in the middle of the street. He didn't walk on the sidewalks, he walked in the middle of the street and was barefooted. And so I ran downstairs in this Victorian and asked my aunt, I said, "Who is that funny man that I just saw walking down the street?" I was about 11 years old at the time. And she said, "Why, he's just kind of a weird guy, a religious man that wants to get people following him, and he thinks he's a seer." And so anyway, Steinbeck in this story tells about Ed Ricketts being out on the Asilomar Beach and looking for specimens. You know, he always carried a bucket with him, and he'd look at for limpets and for sea urchins and any small little crabs and so forth that he would take back as specimens. And he was out there one morning and early in the morning and not feeling too well. He was kind of lonesome, and pretty soon somebody walked up behind him. He didn't even hear him coming up, and he stood over him and he said, "What are you doing? What are you digging for?" He said, "There's no clams here." And Ed Ricketts said, "I know it, that there aren't any." And he said, well, this man then started asking him questions about geology and about the ocean. And Ed Ricketts said, "I always get these people when they ask me these questions." He said, but then he looked around at this man and he saw that he was towering over him, and he had this white hair, and he looked like one of the old people in the Bible, Moses or someone like that. And he had these kind of baby blue eyes, but he said to him, he said, "You know," he says, "I live here on the beach, and I'd like to invite you to come to dinner and come up and see my house." And so he did, and Ed Ricketts walked up behind him, and they went up to a place on the Asilomar Beach, but up above the beach, quite a ways above the beach, there was a little hollow in the sand, and pine trees grew around it, and kind of blown over by the wind, they almost became a roof to this place. And most of the high school kids in Pacific Grove and other kids knew where this place was, and they called it the Rat's Nest. And it was just this little hollow, and the kids would go out there and build a campfire and have a sing, maybe like a church sing or something. It was something to do. That was a lot of fun. But that's where this man took Ed Ricketts, was to this place. And I know exactly what it was like, because I've been there so many times. And he had a fire built there with some rocks, and he said, "I want you to have supper with me." And he brought out as a kind of an hors d'oeuvre, he said, "We'll have sea urchins." And he says, "The male sea urchin gonads taste the best, but we have female ones too." And he said, "You can decide which ones you want." And so he took the sea urchins out of a wet sack, and they cracked them with rocks and ate them, and evidently they were good. He had a loaf of bread up in the limb of a tree, and he took it and they put them on this bread and ate these sea urchins. And then they had limpets, and he said, I put lemon juice on them and I have pins to eat them with. And then he said, I have something like a bouillabaisse, and I put this soup and collect these vegetables. And he said, I get them at the stores. And then Ed Ricketts says, well, what do you do for sweets? Don't you crave sugar sometimes? And he said, yes. He said, you don't take everything you eat from the sea, do you? And he said, no, I go to the stores, and once in a while, he said, I'll steal a candy bar. And he says, I know it isn't right, but I do it anyway because I want the sugar so badly. And so sometimes he would get arrested, and they'd put him in the Monterey County Jail, which I've seen. And Steinbeck, I think, had quite a bit to do with that, in mentioning it in his book, too. But the description that Steinbeck gives of this dinner that he had out on the beach and in this place is just a wonderful story. It's in Sweet Thursday. And so it was, as I say, I tried to find somebody else that ever saw this man, because he was so unusual. I never forgot him.